Hi, and welcome to this podcast to mark the launch of Shakespeare Spectatorship and the Technologies of Performance. When I finished writing the book last year, it felt like I was telling the story of a period that was coming to an end, and which it was important to document because of the way that it was setting up the parameters of how Shakespeare was going to be performed in the coming decade. But as I revisited it today for this podcast in the middle of a global pandemic which has seen all theatres closed and audiences put into lockdown in their individual homes, it actually felt both as though the book belonged entirely to another era of communal theatre going, and oddly prescient about the present moment of social distancing and the shift of nearly all cultural activity to the digital sphere. The book itself is concerned with technological experimentations in productions of early modern drama between 2009 and 2016. In that short period, we saw innovations in the integration of live videos, social media and performance capture on stages. We saw the massive arrival on the UK and US scene of theatre broadcasts. And we also saw the exciting experimentation with the power of candlelight and architecturally determined sightlines at the newly opened Sam Wanamaker Playhouse in London. Instead of separating analogue performances like those at the Wanamaker Playhouse from intermediate and digital performances such as we saw at the National Theatre and the RSC, I suggest that all these productions of early modern drama are doing actually quite similar things in activating ways of relating to the performances and the performers that are profoundly rooted in the technologies that Shakespeare and his contemporaries themselves had at their disposal in the 16th and 17th centuries. A lot of thinking by leading performance theorists has been concerned with the uniqueness of live analogue performance and with the suggestion that any kind of mediation or remediation is taking theatre away from its core, which is the interaction within a single space and time of a performer and their audience. There's an argument that it's only in that theatrical encounter that genuinely ethical engagement with the performance and a sense of mutual exchange and shared responsibility for one another and for the performance is possible. I'm revisiting that debate and suggesting that technologies can play a role in theatre that doesn't diminish such interaction and its ethical dimension, but that instead they can even enhance it. I use the work of scholars such as Nicholas Rideout and Hans Thies Lehmann to suggest that what makes theatre a space for ethical interaction is its capacity to endow both the actor and the spectator with the ability to respond and to contribute to the production of images. Audiences who are engaged in the generation of meanings in analogue and virtual theatre are able, through their responses, to be responsible. They're active participants who can take action both within the performance and more broadly in the social and political sphere. The productions I look at show how present-day performance technologies enable 21st century audiences who are deeply enmeshed in digital information technologies to reactivate the dynamic and fluid performer-spectator relationships that characterise the performance and spatial technologies of the early modern playhouse. As I see it, digital technologies are not intrinsically different from analogue technologies such as candlelight and the use of architectural sightlines, because all these different technological tools are able to create intense and sometimes disturbingly visceral individual and collective experiences. If anything, I think that digital technologies, as they're used in the productions that I analyse in the book, actually often work to intensify the ways in which more traditional performance tools create a sensory and cognitive environment that engages audiences within the fiction of the plays. To explore how audiences engage with theatrical performances in the early modern period, I rely on a model which was developed by the German theatre historian Robert Viman in the 1960s, and which I don't think has lost any of its force. Viman argued that in late medieval theatre the performance space was divided into two physical zones that afforded distinct modes of audience engagement. One, which he called the locus, was the area on a scaffold on which characters fully inhabited the world of the fiction without ever breaking out of it to acknowledge the audience. The other, which he called the platea, or the place, was the area around and in front of that scaffold. Performers who inhabited this space were able to relate to the performers on the scaffold, but they were also able to move freely between the scaffold and the audience area and to talk directly to their audience. I use that distinction between the locus and the platea in my book, but instead of thinking of these spaces as strictly physical, I see them as more conceptual modes of performance and of viewing, more of a mindset of the performer and of the spectator than an actual physical space. And I also add to those two zones a third zone, which I call the obscene, as in what's outside the scene, off stage, not quite visible, but still somehow belonging to the stage. I see this zone as related to the so-called discovery space in the early modern playhouses, which was used to half conceal and half reveal scenes of violence or sex behind a curtain. Think of Polonius being stabbed behind the arras, or of Desdemona's bed. I argue that the obscene mode of performance engagement is triggered whenever the audience is asked to project themselves into the fiction and piece out something they can't quite see or comprehend with what they imagine is happening, and that the obscene has the power to actually magnify the obscenity of what's actually happening and being shown. So while a locus mode of performance doesn't acknowledge the audience, and a platea mode engaging the audience in direct interaction by sort of thrusting the performance towards the audience, an obscene mode pulls the audience into the action. It makes them project their own obscene imagination into the fiction in order to flesh out the information that they only have partial access to. It's this alternation between different modes of performance and viewing that I see at play in a lot of what we're experiencing at this historical moment, as we're all in lockdown and lots of us are binge watching online streams of Shakespeare productions that have been uploaded by theatres across Western Europe and North America. Much of what I say in the book about how digital technologies have fundamentally changed not only how Shakespeare is performed, but also how we as spectators can access performances of Shakespeare and how we relate to those performances through digital media speaks directly to what we're experiencing at this moment. For example, in the book, I talk about how productions of Shakespeare that take place through social media and which involve their audiences who are themselves social media users in the creation of a fictional environment. What you get in such productions is a variation of that crucial relationship between locus, platea and the obscene. There's a prescripted part of the performance which the spectators can't really change or alter through their presence. That's in the locus. This is complemented by platea moments where the performers reach out to the audience and directly ask them for interaction. And on top of that, there are obscene modes of interaction where spectators of their own accord go into the fiction because they're frustrated by it, because it's withheld something from them, and they start to contribute to it in often disruptive and obscene ways. There's an RSC production of Romeo and Juliet on Twitter, which Erin Sullivan and Maurizio Calvi have also written about, for example. And their audience participation got a little bit out of hand when some audience members started to use the production's hashtag and dialogue to tweet obscene images of women's breasts without the women's permission. And that production, along with the other social media Shakespeare experiments that the RSC carried out throughout the last decade, has prepared the ground for the current explosion in performances of Shakespeare through Zoom and social media, which is taking place under lockdown conditions. I've been really struck when watching some of those Zoom performances by the extent to which the performers switch between locus and platea modes, between being locked within the fiction of Shakespeare's play and using their webcam to reach out to both their fellow performers and their viewers. I've also noticed the extent to which this mode of performance activates an obscene mode of viewing, whereby the spectator voyeuristically intrudes in the homes of the performers and starts to construct meanings out of the things that they only half see and that aren't strictly connected to the production. There's a really interesting production of The Tempest by Oxford-based Creation Theatre, who've converted their real-life immersive production that they performed in 2019 into a Zoom interactive lockdown performance, and you can still see it this weekend. I'd really recommend the experience. It's a Tempest in which Ariel asks each audience member in their individual environments to participate in the production by, for example, clicking their fingers so that the noise that is collectively generated by dozens of audience members at their individual computers combines into the sound of plopping rain. The production in that way uses the affordances of the Zoom platform with its ability to mute or unmute the microphones of all participants in the session and to bring participants into each other's view, to create a sense of collective ownership of and contribution to the performance, even as we're all separated into our individual homes. That's a really exciting experience at a time of isolation and lockdown, and it just shows how the new modes of digital performance that I talk about in the book are really coming into their own in the current current moment of crisis. There's also something disturbingly voyeuristic and potentially obscene about the ability to look into the homes of the performers and of other audience members during lockdown and imagine what's not quite being shown. At the end of the performance, when the actors take down the green screens that they've been using in order to generate virtual backgrounds and they reveal their living spaces, that dismantling of the artifice of theatre and the glimpse of the real is both exciting and disconcerting as it troubles the experience of virtual theatre. The other way in which the book is strangely both out of date and prescient about the current moment is in its concern with theatre broadcasting. Within the Anglophone world, I suggested that this genre, especially for productions of Shakespeare, was probably running out of steam because it's so very expensive to produce. And once you've got 4 or 5 recorded productions of, say, Othello, there isn't so much audience demand for new material that would justify more cinema releases of new productions. But I've been proved so wrong by the current turn of events, because what we're seeing at the moment is an incredible explosion in the availability of live streams and such a huge desire by audiences across the globe for the sorts of communal experience generated by viewing something at the same time, even if from different spaces, and by the experience of chatting about it, either through a YouTube comments function or live tweeting or a post-performance Zoom catch-up between friends. So it's clear that this genre has a real future after all. That future might no longer be linked to cinema releases, but I've had quite a few conversations now with people who've never watched online streams before and who are now really sold on the experience. I don't think they're going to go back. And since there is such a huge upsurge in consumption of streamed Shakespeare productions, it's the more important to be aware of what exactly the technology is doing as it's translating stage productions into broadcasts. What I show in the book is that although a lot of the publicity generated by the likes of NT Live and RSC Live from Stratford-upon-Avon has insisted that watching a broadcast is just like watching something in a theatre, that's not actually the case. Camera angles, zooms and the direction of tracking movements, as well as the selection of which parts of the stage to show, or the point of view from which something is shown, all have a significant impact on how a production is perceived. And what's really insidious is that we don't even necessarily notice to what extent our own perception is being manipulated by the technologies of broadcasting. So this is a point in time when pretty much all of the Shakespeare that we access is remediated through broadcast. And whereas in the theatre, we as an individual and collective audience are able to make up our own minds about what we make of the production, as broadcast audiences who are far more subject to almost invisible manipulation of our perception. And that's surely something that we need to be aware of as we enter this moment of almost exclusive dependence on digital media and remediation for our consumption, not just of culture, but also of news more generally. Added to that, we need to be much more aware of the ways in which the technologies themselves incorporate biases, because they aren't neutral, but are themselves culturally constructed, because they're literally built by people who are shaped by their ideologies to such an extent that they hardwire their own ideological preconceptions into the technologies that they build. Now, that's not exactly a new insight. There's work by film scholar Richard Dyer that reminds us of how technologies are both technical and social and therefore also ideological. We've also recently heard from feminist campaigner Caroline Criado Perez, who's been really good at drawing attention to how everyday technologies such as safety goggles or seat belts have been built for normative, white, able-bodied men, with the result that they often don't fit and therefore protect the bodies of anyone who deviates from that norm. I have to admit personally to feeling quite alarmed in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic to see the extent to which the emergency response has relied on a one-size-fits-all technological response, with personal protective equipment provided in sizes that are problematic for female or smaller bodies and vaccine trials carried out exclusively with male subjects. I obviously don't have the medical knowledge that would equip me to make a judgment as to whether this is a safe way of proceeding, but the research I've done for this book is making me at least ask the question of whether there are biases in the technologies that we use and create to respond to the pandemic, and whether these technologies are going to have adverse effects on parts of the population because they're not designed for them. In the book, I use some of the research that Lorna Roth has carried out at Concordia University in Canada on video screen colour balancing to talk about how the cameras used for most mainstream theatre broadcasts are calibrated in such a way that in moments when performers with lighter and darker skin tones share the stage and the screen, the image will be picking out the contrasts in the face of the lighter skinned performer better than those in the face of the dark skinned performer. When I talked to a technician involved in broadcasts, he strongly denied that this was the case, but you just have to look carefully at the outcome to see that something quite disturbing happens whenever you've got two performers of different races in a single shot. So this can lead to, for example, the murder scene in Othello showing Desdemona's face really clearly, while Othello is only visible as a black blob. When I looked at that scene with my students, none of them noticed that anything was wrong, because we're so obviously incorporating into our biased perception the notion that black faces aren't visible or don't really have to be visible, and we then automatically focus on the face that we can see, which is that of Desdemona. So a scene which is shared between these two characters and in which actually Othello is going through a huge emotional journey, which is massively important in the theatre, is in the broadcast turned into a scene in which we focus on Desdemona. If we then go away from our screens and think about the production and end up praising the performance of the white performers, and then if we start to give theatre awards based literally on what we've been able to see clearly, then that does a lot to explain why so consistently theatre awards go to white rather than black performers. It's no marvel then that there is such an issue still with casting black, Asian and minority ethnic performers in key roles. And if we're going to have ever more theatre broadcasts, and these broadcasts become key to planning decisions by theatre companies, then something as tiny and invisible as a camera setting can have a really significant and disturbing impact on racial representation in the theatre. Well, I hope that this has been enough to give you a sense of how thinking about technologies of performance and how they have an impact on how we view performance, on what we see, and on how we respond to what we see and take responsibility for what and how we see is particularly important at this moment in time when many of us are binge watching live streams and consuming culture and information without much visible agency and responsibility. I've just embarked on writing a follow-up to this book, which looks specifically at the current moment in which Shakespeare is used so prominently as a cultural reference point and a communal activity in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That project is called Viral Shakespeare, Performance in the Time of Pandemic, and will provide a snapshot analysis of the digital Shakespeare performance landscape during the March and April months of lockdown in 2020. But before that comes out, I'm hoping that you'll enjoy this book. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again when Viral Shakespeare is out. Thank you. Bye.